In this episode, we talk about sexual violence and suicide. Please take care while listening. On the northeast corner of Kansas, right on the state line, sits the town of Kansas City. It's not that Kansas City, not the Kansas City in Missouri with the Super Bowl rings and the Major League Baseball team. This is Kansas City, Kansas, a town of about 150,000, sitting smack dab in the middle of the country on the edge of the Missouri River. Here, dozens of women had a secret. They said they'd been raped, assaulted, and stalked by the same man. Some said they met him through his job. Others said he'd hit on them on the street, asking them if they liked white men. Some of the women did sex work, others suffered from addiction. Others were poor or struggling. Many of them were mothers, all but a handful were Black. And at least one was not a woman, but a girl, around 13 years old. Here's Ophelia Williams, one of the women who says that she was assaulted.
He didn't come back one time to rape me. He came back and back.
The women say that after he attacked them, he threatened them, and he knew things about their lives and their loved ones. So, they kept their mouth shut, some for as long as 30 years. And few, if any, reported him. Because what would be the point?
And he always said, I said, I'm going to tell. And he said, who you going to tell? I said, I'm going to call the police. He said, I am the police.
The he is Roger Golubski, alleged rapist, abuser, kidnapper. He was a detective in the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, or the KCKPD. And before he retired in 2010, Golubski had been with the KCKPD for 35 years. In the past few years, the allegations against Roger Golubski have gone from whispers to headlines to federal indictments and civil lawsuits. But allegedly, his wrongdoing goes beyond the criminal charges. He's accused of everything, from framing people for murder to committing murder himself.
Roger Golubski has been charged with deplorable crimes. Although the crimes date back 20 to 25 years ago, he did wear the uniform and caused pain to members of this community and shame to the badge. Based on these charges, Golubski's tenure in law enforcement was a moral, ethical, and legal failure.
That voice you hear is Carl Oakman, the police chief in Kansas City, Kansas. The few times the KCKPD has been willing to talk about Golubski at all, they've used rhetoric like this. He's made to sound like a singular monstrosity, like a cancer that infected the department, one they removed. But of course, in stories like these, there's rarely just one monster. The one bad apple, it's largely a myth. And even his victims allege that the problem was never just Roger Golubski. People in Kansas City say that the police, and others, including at least one former prosecutor, seemed more concerned with protecting each other than protecting Black residents. They say Golubski was enabled by his colleagues who watched silently as he ruined lives. They say that he didn't act alone. I'm Josie Duffy Rice, and this is Corruption Uncovered, a podcast from Rock Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Rock. So I'm a journalist who covers the criminal justice system, particularly police and prosecutorial misconduct. And yet, somehow, until Team Rock, I really hadn't heard much about Roger Golubski. Team Rock has been focused on this story for years, They've been partnering with the Midwest Innocence Project since 2021, and they've been working hard to undo some of the damage that Golubski allegedly created. This podcast, Rock Nation's First, was born out of that work and the work of the lawyers and the advocates and community members in Kansas City. Journalists, especially in Kansas City, have done incredible work on this story. KCUR made Overlooked about his wrongdoing. Melinda Henneberger, a columnist at the Kansas City Star, even won a Pulitzer for her commentary on Golubski. And look, I know by now that not every shocking story will capture national attention. But even for me, someone who is constantly hearing outrageous stories, this one is particularly depraved, especially because it allegedly went on for decades. This month, December of 2024, Roger Golubski was scheduled to face trial in federal court on charges carrying a potential life sentence. But on the first day of the trial, he didn't appear.
And we start with breaking news here at noon. This is a live look near the house of former KCK detective Roger Golubski.
So the judge issued a warrant for his arrest. At the courthouse, survivors and their supporters were gathered. As they stood in the bitter cold, some news started to filter through the crowd.
So we're getting some preliminary reports that there's police tape around Golubski's house. And it sounds like he will probably not be facing a judge or jury here on this earth, but he'll be facing one soon.
When police went to his house, they found his body. Roger Golubski was dead from a gunshot, reportedly by suicide. Many of his victims had hoped that a trial leading to a conviction could finally give them something: justice, safety, some peace. And in the wake of his death, they're left to grapple with what happens now, for themselves, for the police department, and maybe the whole city. Because there are stories that still need to be told, and truth that's still waiting to come out. Kansas City, Kansas was born of industry. A tough city, a working one, built with the grit of the railroads. Now, in some ways, it's a forgotten city, especially certain parts of it, like Quindaro, the place where our story begins. As a little girl, back in the 1970s, Michelle Houcks lived in Kansas City with her mother and her siblings. Most of her family lived nearby too, and Michelle spent her time outside, playing and running around.
I was a free-spirited little kid. I used to love to go outside and play hide and go seek and, hopscotch, just, enjoy the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
The neighborhood was, back then, it was fun. You would play with all the neighborhood kids. You had to be in before the streetlights came on, just the normal stuff.
And what neighborhood was this?
I grew up down by Quindaro.
Michelle is Black, and Quindaro is a Black neighborhood on the north side of Kansas City. Quindaro has a long history. Once upon a time, it was a battleground. When Kansas became a U.S. territory back in the 1850s, it was a landing place for the restless moving west. And when the government announced that settlers could vote to decide whether Kansas would be a slave state or a free state, enslavers and abolitionists rushed west, hoping to outnumber the other. The slavery supporters had a few strongholds: Leavenworth, Atchison, and the other Kansas City, Missouri. But the anti-slavery advocates had their own tools. For one, they had John Brown, the famous abolitionist. And they also had the township of Quindaro. Quindaro was something like a miracle. Originally, it was a settlement created by the Wyandot tribe and was a true multicultural community before such a term was even used. And ultimately, it became kind of a symbol of resistance. It was the site of the Quindaro Freedman School, later called Western University, which, according to the Kansas City Star, was the first Black school west of the Mississippi. Quindaro was even a stop on the Underground Railroad. But by the time Michelle was a kid, all that was left of Quindaro the settlement was some overgrown ruins in a park. Even Western University had shut down, leaving behind a single statue of John Brown. Quindaro had been, in many ways, abandoned. So Michelle and her mom and her siblings moved around some. But when Michelle was almost an adult, her family came back to Kansas City for good.
And then in the 12th grade, I came back to Wyandotte County.
What was that like to be gone for 5 years and then come back?
When I came back, everything was still kind of the same. All this was before, the crack epidemic came about. So everything was still basically the same. It still felt safe to be outside at night. You could walk up and down the street without any fear.
At the time, Kansas City was changing. White people were fleeing the city, headed for the suburbs. There wasn't as much opportunity as there once had been. And then, Michelle says, things got worse. You said it was before the crack epidemic came.
Yes.
What do you remember kind of a big change in the neighborhood once that happened?
Yes. Basically, you would just see a lot of people walking up and down the street, hanging out on the corners a whole lot more. People would start looking zombie-ish. The neighborhood started getting dirty. It was just a different scenery altogether.
When she was in her early 20s, Michelle says she encountered Roger Golubski for the first time. She remembers it clearly. It was a September night in the early 1990s.
Well, the first time that I ever saw him was probably about 6 or 7 or 8 o'clock at night. I was up under the pavilion at Parkwood Park.
That park she's referencing, it's right on Quindaro Boulevard.
I had just got into it with my boyfriend, so I left the house to go and cool off. And I guess he saw me from the street, and he came and told me that it was not safe to be in the park. And if I needed any assistance, I told him no, but he told me that it wasn't safe and he'll take me home. And so that's how I first met him.
What was kind of your perception of him?
Well, he was the police, and I seen his badge, so I was comfortable with, getting in the car with him. I didn't feel threatened. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't do any of that. He seemed nice and polite.
Up until then, Michelle remembers having pretty decent impressions of the police.
Well, when I grew up, the police were friendly. They used to come to our school and give out coloring books, baseball cards, football cards. We used to call them officer friendly. So when I grew up, the police were generally very nice. You used to look forward to them coming to the school because they would give out McDonald's coupons where you can go to McDonald's and get a cheeseburger or some fries. So back then they were really nice.
She wasn't a kid anymore, sure, but she says she had never been in trouble with the law. Golubski was in plain clothes, and Michelle says he was driving an unmarked police car. But he showed her his badge, and as far as she knew, police could generally be trusted. So she got in the car. I decided not to ask Michelle to recount the details of what happened next, just because they're so brutal and she's recounted them enough these past few years, including in a lawsuit that she and others filed against Golubski and the KCKPD. The suit alleges that Golubski didn't take Michelle home. Instead, he drove her in his car to a different neighborhood, nearly 2 miles away. Then, he pulled into a wooded area, told her to get out of his car, and ordered her to perform oral sex. Michelle cried. She resisted. But he allegedly vaginally raped her, then anally raped her, and then forced her to perform oral sex anyway. And Michelle says that when she screamed, "Why are you doing this?" Golubski calmly replied, "Because I can." When he finished raping her, Michelle says Golubski drove her back to Parkwood Park, exactly where he'd found her, and he left her there.
After everything was over, he told me to keep my mouth closed. And I let him know I wasn't going to say anything. And he told me if I did say anything, harm would come to me and I would come up missing like so many others. And, he showed me his gun earlier, so I believed him. Like, he could kill me at this moment. If he took me and did what he had just done to me, and he's the police, why couldn't he? We was in a field, so why couldn't he do what he needed to do to me and dispose of me? So I believed him. And I didn't want to be a victim that came up missing.
Michelle says that she made her way back to her boyfriend's house. She was upset, and she wanted to see a doctor and get checked out. But she knew that she couldn't tell the whole story. So she lied.
I told everyone that I was raped by 2 black guys because he told me to keep my mouth closed.
She went to a hospital across the state line in Missouri to have a rape kit done.
Well, I went there to get checked out, and they checked me out. They did a rape kit. They gave me the morning after pill, and they said they had to call the police. So once they called the police, after they called the police, I hurried up and got my boyfriend, and we got out of there because I was scared that he would find out. They called the police, so he told me to keep my mouth closed, and I didn't. I wasn't going to tell that he did it, but I still talked to somebody, so I was scared and I left. I never did follow up with it. I stayed away from the hospital after that because I didn't do what he told me to do.
Michelle says she saw him just one other time. It happened in the months after he raped her. And this time, he didn't just threaten her. He threatened her family.
I saw him one day when I was walking up Quindaro, me and my friend. And I guess he saw me. But once he saw me, he came and talked to me. And that's how I saw him. He asked me to step away from my friend and come and talk to him. So we stepped away a couple of feet, and he asked me, have I said anything? I told him no. I kept my mouth closed like he told me to do. And he told me to keep my mouth closed, and that's when he told me my brother's name and all that. I guess he did his research, and if I said anything, something would happen to my brother.
Tell me about your reaction when he said your brother's name.
My eyes got big. I'm like, I just felt he did his research. So if he took the time to find out, my brother stayed in Kansas. So if he took the time to find that out, what else does he know?
Michelle never forgot those threats. For years, 30 years in fact, she says she kept her word and that she never told anyone that the man who raped her was in fact a cop.
He just told me, don't say anything or harm would come to me. And I believed him because if he had just done what he done to me and he's an officer, who would believe me like he told me? Who would believe me? And I believe that, who would believe me? I was just a average black woman I was still young. I was just an average black woman. And who would believe me over him? So I kept my mouth closed.
Seeing him again that day on the street like that, it scared Michelle so much that she decided to avoid the city entirely.
And I stayed out of Kansas for a while out of fear of running into him again because, my friends stayed off of Quindaro. So, you only had Quindaro to walk on. So I ran into him then out of fear of running into him again. I just stayed out of Kansas.
How long were you out of Kansas for?
Probably a couple of years before I came back over there because I was, scared of being over there. I didn't want to run into him.
Michelle says the rape changed her entire life. It didn't only affect how she trusted police, but how she trusted anyone. And even now, over 30 years later, she says that's the moment her life took a turn for the worse.
Actually, after all that happened, my life started going in a downward spiral. I started being suicidal. I actually tried to commit suicide. I ended up in Wyandotte mental health for trying to kill myself. I didn't want to live because he took a part of me that I could never get back. It was very hard, to have someone take something from you that is so precious to you. And especially being a police officer, someone that I grew up trusting.
For years, Michelle dealt with another emotion, guilt. She thought perhaps the rape was her fault.
I felt that I messed up because he didn't force me to get in the car. I got in the car because I trusted him. So had I not trusted him and got in that car, I don't feel any of this would have happened. So for a while, I blamed myself because I willingly got in that car.
She says she thought about what he did to her every day, but still, she said nothing. Then, in 2022, all of a sudden, Roger Golubski's name was everywhere, thanks to a man named Lamont McIntyre. In 1994, at age 17, McIntyre was arrested for a murder that he has always insisted he did not commit. A murder that he says Roger Golubski pinned on him, framing him as the killer despite knowing he was innocent. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison. Golubski later sat for a deposition regarding McIntyre's wrongful conviction, pleading the fifth 555 times. McIntyre was eventually exonerated in 2017 after spending 23 years in prison. But Golubski never admitted any wrongdoing. And even though the city eventually paid McIntyre millions in a settlement, they've also denied accusations of misconduct. So as the McIntyre case gained more attention, so did Golubski. And slowly, other stories about his time as a KCKPD officer started bubbling to the surface. But still, Michelle kept quiet.
The first time I heard this, I seen his name. I seen it on Facebook. I was still very scared and untrusting, and I just didn't want to be out there in the public eye like that where no one knew my name. And he's a cop, so how did I know if he had friends or, that would come and harm me or do something to my family or anything? Because, look what I already been through. So I still trusted what he said. And I felt like he still had a hold of me.
I imagine that finally seeing his name in the news would bring Michelle relief, maybe? Joy? But she says that in many ways, it was actually the opposite.
When I started hearing his name again, it started bringing up, I had buried that part of me, and it started bringing up old wounds, and I just started, crying, and I had to relive everything that happened to me again, hearing his name. And it was a while. I still hadn't seen his face or anything, so I still hadn't seen him. Because his face really wasn't in on the news and stuff like that back then, when all this first kicked off. But after a while, then I actually started seeing his face on TV, but it took a while to even, get that far with seeing him.
Michelle realized that her suspicions were correct. He had allegedly assaulted other women, too.
I didn't know it was so many of us. So I knew I couldn't have been the only one because he was too comfortable with doing what he did. So I knew I wasn't the only one.
For years, Michelle was afraid to call the police at all, for anything, even outside of Kansas City. And even when she finally told people who had actually raped her, Michelle was terrified. But she decided to speak up, in part because one of the biggest things that she had worried about was no longer a factor.
When I told my story, I only told my story because he couldn't hurt my brother anymore. My brother was deceased. So he knew my brother's name, and my brother wasn't here anymore. So when I told my story, I let them know that I tell my story because my brother's not here anymore. No harm can come to my brother. But I told my story, and I was still very scared, and I didn't want my name or my picture out there in the public because I was scared, because I was still scared of him. So I did my story in silhouette.
When she first spoke with a columnist at the Kansas City Star, Michelle wasn't named in the story. But despite her desire to stay anonymous, she says her identity quickly became public.
Sometimes I feel like I'm walking in a daze because it's finally out there. Even though, as I keep saying, I didn't want it to be like this. I wanted to stay in the shadows. I never was going to get up and testify. I was only going to do my one story, one and done, and I was going to be done with it. But, Only thing I can say is it's the Most High, it's God, because I talk to him every day and I thank him for letting me still be here. And it had to be him because the fear had taken over me. And I'm not, everyone tells me now, Michelle, aren't you scared that something's going to happen to you? And like I said, if it does, it does. I can't keep walking in fear because I've walked in fear for so long. It tears you down, it wears you down, and I wasn't living. And now I'm living. I'm stronger than what I was. I'm a survivor, and I'm going to keep surviving. I can't live my life on what if. I have to live my life on what will be.
The 30 years of silence took a toll on Michelle.
I mean, when you get raped, it really takes something out of you. Someone took something from you that's precious, and you relive it in your mind. You relive it. You still have that fear when you're walking down the street that it's going to happen again. You don't trust men like you should or any of that, because a police officer is supposed to be the person that you trust the most, like your mother. They are hired to protect and serve. And I believe that's what he was doing for me. And he did the total opposite. He made me live a nightmare for years. I looked over my shoulder for years. I didn't trust the police. I didn't want to be bothered with them. I didn't trust them. It was just a scary, eerie, feeling back then. I still don't trust them.
I talked to Michelle when Golubski was still alive and a potential reckoning was at hand. I wondered what she was hoping for, what she wanted to see happen.
I just want justice for not just me and everyone else that he caused harm to. And just to give us just a little bit of hope that we matter, because we do. And what he did to me and others, it wasn't right. And we didn't ask for that. So to make us heal a little bit and make me heal a little bit, I want him to have his day, not just his day. I want him to feel the jail that he put us in for so long, because we were in jail inside of ourselves. We were in jail inside of our minds. We were encaged within our minds. There wasn't a day that didn't go by that I didn't think about what happened to me or relive what happened to me. But, you just keep trying to go on and hope one day that justice will prevail. Yeah, it took 30 years, but we're here now. So I just want to see what's going to happen in court and if they're going to give that monster his day. Like they say, every dog have their day and some have too. And look at him now. He's weak. He's frail. He's not the man that he used to be. So now he has to deal with this jail within himself that he had us living in for all these years, and this fear. But I know he's not sleeping good like we didn't used to sleep good. I know he's not sleeping good right now because he don't know what this outcome is going to be for himself. So I know that his sleep he's not hardly getting any. I know he's not, because we didn't. We didn't get any sleep of fear of thinking that he was going to come and get us, or he was like the boogeyman, So right now, the justice, the long hand of the law is a boogeyman for him right now, because he don't know what his outcome is gonna be. He has to step in that courtroom. He's gonna be weak walking in that courtroom. He's not that strong man that he used to be. He's not that anymore. Even if whatever happens, I'm glad of that.
Michelle's hope that a trial would make Golubski face his years of alleged wrongdoing, make him feel the shame that she had felt for so many years. It's gone now. Golubski is dead. and she and the others are left to figure out what now. Before we finish talking, I asked Michelle one last question. How does she imagine that her life would have gone had this not happened? And in a way, it was the hardest part of our conversation, to ask her to imagine this alternate universe, this better life, if only she hadn't happened to be in the park that one evening.
I probably would have prospered and my life probably would have went different. I probably wouldn't have been as depressed. I was depressed all my life. I wasn't trusting. I sabotaged a lot of things that came in my life as far as jobs, and because I didn't want to live, so I didn't really care about life. Had this not happened, I would have been a happy woman.
There was something else Michelle said that stuck with me. She's certain that he's not the only one responsible.
They were like a gang. He couldn't have done this alone. I'm not going to say everyone in the department knew, but there were certain people there that knew. He's not the only one. He's just one of many. But the other ones that have done this in other states, this need to be publicized so they'll know, that their day's coming too. Victims just need to pray and pray that those other officers come to justice as well, because there's no way he did this alone.
In 2022, Golubski was indicted twice in federal court. The trial that was supposed to start this week, United States v. Roger Golubski, would have been the first and was against Golubski alone. Federal prosecutors have said that they have evidence of at least 9 victims of his sexual assaults, including 2 victims identified in the indictment by their initials, OW and SK. Now, in the wake of his death, this case has been dismissed. But there's also the second indictment, and in that one, Golubski was just one of 4 defendants. The men have been charged with conspiring to hold young women in what the law calls involuntary sexual servitude. Now, the question is, will that case proceed? And either way, people say these charges barely scratch the surface of what Golubski allegedly did over his 3 decades with the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. It's not just Ophelia Williams or Michelle Houcks or the many other women who have now spoken out about Golubski. The circle of his alleged victims is much bigger. It's people like Violet Martin, who says her brother and cousin were framed for a murder they did not commit. The murder of Roger Golubski's nephew.
I was 16 at the time my brother was convicted. And my moment of I'm going to fight came from my mother. She walked up to my brother after the sentence of 25 to life. And my mother said, "It is not written in stone. We are going to fight."
People like Davelyn Dobbs.
In 2009, my son, Donnell Dobbs, was convicted of a murder that he did not commit. And because of the misconduct of Roger Golubski and the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department, he has done 16 years. It has been very difficult and very hard to deal with as a parent, as a mother, and just as a human being of that community where he was supposed to protect and serve.
People like Lamont McIntyre and his mother, Rosie, who have said for years that Golubski framed him for a reason. As Tricia Rojo Bushnell, executive director of the Midwest Innocence Project, explained,
one of the women that he sexually assaulted was Lamont McIntyre's mother. And when that happened, it happened in the police station. Another police officer walked in, saw what was happening, shut the door, and walked out. She reported him. moved, changed her phone number to get away from him. He continued to harass her.
They believe it can't be a coincidence that Golubski targeted Rosie's son. They see it as punishment, payback. I've been reporting on the criminal justice system for a long time. And a thing that I'm often left wondering is how people who are harmed by that system can get justice or accountability or closure. For some, the trial was supposed to be a step on the road to accountability. But now, Golubski is dead, leaving a lot of unanswered and maybe unanswerable questions. Would a conviction in that case have felt like justice for Michelle and his other alleged victims? Would it have brought closure? What we know is that the trial would not have been enough to address the complicity from so many in his alleged wrongdoing, or eradicate the distrust for these institutions that has grown among so many for so long in Kansas City. A conviction wouldn't guarantee new faith in the KCKPD, who are said to have turned a blind eye to Golubski's behavior for decades, or confidence in the courts that allowed the many questionable convictions he was a part of to stand. Davlin Dobbs' son is still in prison. Women that Golubski was connected to are still missing. Murders remain unsolved, and the local government still hasn't turned over records to advocates that might shed light on the past. The people who gathered at the courthouse on the day the trial was supposed to start are still asking for answers. For them, the case was never just about Roger Golubski.
It is about a system that enabled him, shielded him, and sacrificed the safety and dignity of our community at its altar. We are here to demand justice, not just for the victims of Golubski's heinous crimes, but for a community that has been battered by neglect, corruption, and systemic failures. Let us pause to honor the courage of the survivors, women and families who bore unspeakable pain, who were silenced by fear and power. To those who suffered at the hands of a broken system, we see you, we hear you, and we are here to fight for you.
Throughout this series, we'll bring you the stories of that fight and the women who survived Roger Golubski. We'll look at the path forward from here, not just legally, but emotionally and morally, and how, if at all, people can be made whole. If you or someone you know has been sexually assaulted, you can visit weareteamrock.com/resources. For more information and to take action, visit weareteamrock, that's ROC.com/resources. Corruption Uncovered is a podcast from Rock Nation and its philanthropic and justice division, Team Rock. Team Rock partners with the Midwest Innocence Project to uncover corruption in Kansas City, Kansas. We want to extend a special thanks to the KCK community of survivors and advocates. Corruption Uncovered is produced by Pineapple Street Studios. I'm your host, Josie Duffy Rice. This episode was written and produced by me and Kat Aaron, with additional production support from Justine Dahm, Eric Mennel, and Yinka Rickford-Angwin. Our editor is Joel Lovell. Fact-checking by Natsumi Ajisaka. Music licensing by Ep1. Our recording engineers are Pedro Alvira and Marina Pais. Mixing by Marina Pais. Kat Aaron and J.M. Berry are our executive producers. Thanks to Beck Shackelford Wanganga for her help, and thank you for listening.